ladies and gentlemen, broadcasting to you live, well, not live, but recorded from the bowels of Canuckistan, where our government has just investigated itself and deemed that it didn't do anything wrong with the Emergency Measures Act, where the same people that told us the masks were necessary, the vaccines were necessary, the arrows on the grocery store were necessary, the plexiglass barriers were necessary, the printing of trillions of dollars was necessary, vaccine passports were necessary, inflation was necessary, all these things were necessary, just determined that the Emergency Measures Act was necessary. Go figure. Well, I got a guest today who has been fighting all of this stuff very vociferously for the last couple of years. This guy has been an active member of the PPC with Maxime Bernier. They've been going around fighting these vaccine mandates, being involved in the truckers' convoy. But actually, my guest today has been around a lot longer, talking about something that affects us all. And it's a topic that, frankly, I don't know enough about. And that topic is globalism. I want to find out about globalism, what I should know about it, what exactly it is, how maybe it ties into this pandemic, and go from there. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mark Friesen, the Grizzly Patriot. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely pleasure, Tim. I appreciate the platform.
You betcha. Okay. I've been hearing about globalism for a long time. Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. Now, the latest thing is WEF, WHO, all these kind of global things. How would you define globalism? Is it just simply people trading freely across the globe?
I think it's important to make the distinction when we're talking about globalism versus globalization. I think people tend to get a little bit confused when those two terms get bandied about. Globalism is global governance from an unelected, unaccountable foreign entity, the UN, World Economic Forum. Globalization is sort of a natural progression, with ingenuity and invention in communications and transportation. The world's getting smaller as far as, trade is concerned. And we have to play a role in that. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. If we're going to prosper as a country, we have to take part in the global economy. But that's much different than globalism. And they're actually they've sort of hijacked globalization to bring in globalism, and that's the governance. And really, it's the hyper-centralization of control, hyper-centralization and hoarding of the world's resources, and hyper-centralization of control of the masses, of the people. I mean, their agenda that's evolved since the late 60s in the form of Agenda 21, now it's Agenda 2030. It's gone through its own development and its own evolution over the years, over the decades. And I mean, now it's reached the point of it's at 17 goals. And each one of those goals will affect everybody's lives, all aspects of their lives. And this is what we need to understand.
Right. Okay. So that all sounds absolutely horrible. I don't want some guys in Davos or Germany or wherever these folks hang out controlling my life. But what isn't the real issue, or isn't the issue I'm facing right now my own government? Like, my government holds a gun to my head, says, give me whatever it is, 25% of your income. Don't put that in your body. Don't sell that. Here, if you want to practice as a healthcare professional, you need permission from me, and you need to be constrained. Like, I could go down the list in the ways where if I disobeyed, guns come out and they force compliance or death, basically. Now, how is globalism seems a little bit more sneaky. It's not as in your face as I'm pointing this gun at you and you better comply or die kind of thing, like my government does. It's basically created a plan, a sustainability, and it's voluntary, isn't it, Mark? Like, they're not pointing a gun at Trudeau's head and saying you will sign on to this agenda or there's going to be consequences. How exactly does the UN and these global entities exert control and
Well,
influence over our governments?
yeah, and you're exactly correct, and it must be stated that it's not the UN that is necessarily infiltrated our country, although the World Economic Forum has infiltrated our government's cabinet,
Right. Yeah, they
as
bragged.
stated
Klaus Schwab
as
bragged
stated
about
by
that, didn't
Klaus
he?
Schwab.
Yeah.
Right. So in a way, they have infiltrated, and they have sort of come to us with influence. There's no question about it. But when you look at the UN, and really the UN Agenda 2030, is the pinnacle of globalism. And when you look at that organization, as our nation being part of that organization, there's 195 nations that belong to the United Nations. If you break it down and you look at 135 nations within that 195 are partnered, are in a voting bloc, and that's an enormous amount of influence given to a voting bloc within the makeup of the UN. And of course, most of those nations are second and third world nations who stand to benefit the most from this agenda that's been created. And a lot of this agenda was created really to destroy Western civilization and the freedoms and the liberty that Western civilization represents. And so, of course, this group of 135 nations likes nothing more than to see the destruction of Western civilization when they're the beneficiaries. See, there's this idea that they want equality not only within nation states, but among nation states. And this is goal number 10, where they want that equality. Well, how do you reach equality on a global level between 195 countries? Well, you destroy the first world,
Right.
bring it down to the second, possibly third world standard of living.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's what
And
the
then all of a
Soviet
sudden we're
Union
equal.
did and all these communist countries did to
Yes.
equalize.
Yes.
The thing is that you can't create wealth out of thin air. You can't,
No.
will it into existence by a government fiat. And so the only way to, make everyone equal is to tear down the tall poppies and make them lowly peasants, right?
And
The random kulaks.
from the ashes comes utopia, right?
Right, right. Okay, so we have the problem is the problem with globalism. Then what is the main criticism here? Is it that the particular policies that they're trying to advance, or is it the very idea of kind of a one world government structure itself?
Yeah, and I think it's top down. It's again this global governance from this entity, and an unelected, unaccountable entity.
Right.
And I mean, at the end of the day, as we've mentioned, could our national governments have said no? Sure, of course they could have, and they should have. They should have had the strength to say no. This is not in the best interest of the Canadian people, and actually said no. But what happened was, so this agenda, and some historical context is probably important for your listeners. This agenda was first conceived, contextualized in 1968 at the Club of Rome. And one of the guys that was a contributing member and co-founder of the Club of Rome, a guy by the name of Dennis Meadows, he co-wrote the book with his wife called Limits to Growth. And that's really a foundational piece for this Sustainable Development Agenda, Agenda 21, now it's Agenda 2030. And so it's, as I said, it's gone through its own development and its own evolution. And so it's important to understand that all of this, really, we can even go back after the Second World War and who was responsible for, the deaths of hundreds of millions of people, a couple of different ideologies, communism and fascism, who I place both over on the left. They're both authoritarian, they're both totalitarian. I've never considered Nazis to be on the right, because they're not.
The name is socialist, right? They're national socialists.
National socialist. And the way I look at things, Tim, and you may share this view, is, from that political spectrum, from the left moving toward the right, the further right you go, the more freedom you want from government. the less tyranny you'll accept from your government. And I think as for right up to the point of anarchy.
Right.
And I mean, I'm maybe a little left of anarchy, but that's how I see the political spectrum. So you
Right.
have these two ideologies that are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of millions of people throughout the 20th century, and even before that, that actually after the Second World War came together and they sort of merged, and to develop and gain this global dominance, and so this convergence, and one way to make the distinction between the two ideologies is the UN. Most of their committees are headed up by people that come out of Socialist International, so the communists.
Right.
And then the World Economic Forum, of course, Klaus Schwab was tapped to run that as a support mechanism for this agenda in 1971. And of course, Klaus Schwab's family was a big supporter of Nazis in Germany.
Oh, really?
Through
Okay.
their corporations.
Well, that
Yeah.
doesn't really surprise me, but
No, and it shouldn't surprise anybody. He's the perfect guy to run the sort of the fascist side of this convergence, and that's essentially where we're at today. And again, they've been developing this agenda for a very long time, since the late '60s,
right.
and now the push is on. And it's interesting when we look at this partnership, this formal official coming together in June of 2019, 6 months before COVID. We had the UN and the World Economic Forum officially partner to achieve the goals of sustainable development. That's sort of a red herring. They've always been partnered. The World Economic Forum has always been a support mechanism for this agenda, promoting this agenda, bringing multinationals together, bringing
Right.
the oligarchs and the monopolies and big tech together. And you'll notice, of course, through all of this, and even through most of COVID, all of these multinationals and oligarchs, they're all recording record profits, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And who's suffering the most? Well, the serfs, the
Right.
slaves. We are the people, right? And this is
Yeah.
how it's designed.
Now, do you think that there is, like, how much credit do you give these guys for being competent and able to control things versus how much of this is just kind of a crime of opportunity, let's say, and an amplification of certain ideologies because it will benefit me, right? So for example, I think the idea that the idea of statism and the desire to use government to bring about the greatest possible good. If you believe that the government has a moral right or maybe even an obligation to bring about the greatest possible good, well, you could imagine all sorts of evil things being done in the name of good intentions. In fact, I was debating. I just relaunched this show, and I had a podcasting partner before, so I'm kind of going out on my own here. But one of the things I did was I brought one of the guys from my men's group. I started a men's group in my community because, we want to be better husbands, fathers, entrepreneurs, men of character, that sort of thing. We're missing that. That's another podcast in and of itself. Yeah. But one of the guys is a coworker, and, whenever we work together, we debate. And it's immediate, and we love it. We love debating, and sometimes we swap sides just to try to make the other person's argument better than they can make it themselves. But this guy is what I would call a normie. He's like as blue-pilled as you can get, and he's really good at arguing the blue-pilled position. Now, I had him on my podcast a couple of days ago, and we were talking about 15-minute cities. Have you heard of these things? Yeah, you probably have a lot to say. I'm going to want to pick your brain on these in a second. Sure. But what I was saying to him is, look, he's like, look, you don't know that they have all these plans to control people and lock them down. And I said, okay, well, let me ask you this. Do you think that our ruling classes, let's say the people that are in the mayor's office or in the federal government office or in the provincial offices, do they want to cut down on carbon emissions? He's like, well, yeah, of course. They're worried about climate change. I'm like, yeah, and they've implemented a tax, right? Like they will take money from you through threat of force for doing that. Well, yeah, of course. Well, so So let me ask you this: if we have this city here and they're trying to cut down on carbon emissions because climate catastrophe and traffic congestion and all these other things, I mean, would it be that hard to sell to you, sir, to have some barricades put up and to maybe issue fines and to control people and try to keep them confined to a neighborhood and restrict traffic in these cities? You said, well, no, that makes perfect sense to me, of course. So I know this guy. He's a good guy. He's not an evil man. He's he's a normie, right? He's blue pilled. He doesn't understand yet that if this were 1930s Germany, he'd be going right along with the Nazis pushing Jews into ovens, because you know what I mean. Yep. But so part of my goal here, Mark, with this podcast, I want to have these blue pill people on. I want to have normies, people I disagree with, try to figure out how to persuade, how to cut through this thing, how to have constructive conversations with them. But you in that conversation, it was almost chilling to me how easy it would be to. You just have to agree with the idea that the government should control these things and implement this good, and that this problem is real, and then we'll give up our liberty because that's.
But Tim, I think one of the problems is somewhere along the way, society, in a big picture sense, has lost its ability to think critically. Right? Like even in terms of climate change and this whole narrative. That CO2 is the driver of climate change. Well, that's not true. That's actually not a fact. CO2 is plant food. Everybody, we all went to grade 6, 7, or 8 science and learned about photosynthesis and the importance of CO2.
Yes.
For plant life and for our life. If CO2 goes below 150 parts per million in the atmosphere, all life on Earth begins to die. So why are we talking about net zero? Why are we talking about reducing CO2? There was actually a study that came out of the Lancet a couple of years ago where they tasked a bunch of research scientists to come back and report back as to why the Earth has been greening so much the last couple of decades.
Right.
And they reported back, and their answer was because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yeah, and there's more CO2.
Encouraging
but see, Mark,
more
there's
growth.
change. It's changing. It changes bad. We need climate stasis or something like that.
Well, and this is the thing: is climate has always changed, and humanity's always been able to adjust and adapt and to invent and build and create to deal with what Mother Nature brings to us.
Right.
And this idea that we need some sort of global governance to dictate all aspects of our life in order to solve a problem that doesn't exist is insane to me.
But and even if the problem did exist, if climate catastrophe was on the horizon, why do we jump straight to big government and global governance as the answer? What about liberty? Liberty should be the default. And this is one of the mistakes I think that people on the right often make, is they argue about these facts about, well, is climate catastrophe happening, or how dangerous is COVID versus how dangerous is the vaccine. We get into the weeds on all this stuff, and I say, look, even if everything they say is true, 9/11 wasn't an inside job. COVID is a highly dangerous pandemic, maybe the most dangerous pandemic ever. Climate catastrophe is on the edge, and we're years away from the end of the earth. Even if all that's true, that's an even stronger argument that we ought to limit government immediately and abolish it, because
the free market will figure it out.
Yeah,
the free market will figure it out. We're good that way. Humans are great that way.
Right. So I guess where I was going with all this is, where do you really see the problem, right? Because on one hand, is it simply a matter of unmasking these bastards and pointing out the nefarious puppet masters and people, or is it about the normies, like the guy in my men's group who it just kind of goes along with institutional inertia?
Yeah, you know what? I really truly believe that most of the normies, like I think of just the neighborhood I live in. If I went door to door talking about this stuff to people, they'd gloss over, right? They would have no idea how to absorb any of what I'm talking about. The fact is, they don't want Mark Friesen to burst the bubble that they live in.
Yeah,
they don't, because I'm bringing bad news to them. I'm bringing the news that, their life isn't as rosy as they might think it is. But the unfortunate thing for these people is the reality of the situation is going to do that anyway. It's
Right.
going to burst their bubble anyway. And that's what I'm waiting for. Like, a lot of people just won't accept this discussion because it's too overwhelming. It's too much. But when it happens to them, they're going to be looking for answers. And they're going to remember the seeds that I planted in conversations I've had. And the light bulb's going to go on, and they're going to say, yeah, you know what?
Yeah.
This guy talked about this a while ago, and they're going to make it relative to their situation. So we're going to be meeting a lot more pain here in the near future.
Yeah.
And that's what it's going to take, I think, before the greater society sort of wakes up to what's really going on and can actually effectively oppose what's coming. And again, it's all coming from our own governments, federal, provincial, and municipal. It's all being implemented through those levels of government. This isn't, like I said, this isn't the UN that is, I mean, there is probably some pressure being put on by those entities, UN, World Economic Forum, on our governments. But ultimately, it's our governments that are implementing it. And
Right.
it was the Conservative Party in 2008. A lot of people will say but none of this is binding. Well, it is actually, because the Conservative government in 2008 created a law where it's now it's compelling our governments to report our progress in achieving the goals of sustainable development to the UN, an unelected, unaccountable foreign entity. So it's in law. It is binding. We have to abide by this because we created this law, and so a lot of people don't understand that part of it as well. And so here we are, and now we're compelled to report our success in achieving the goals of sustainable development. It's
What do you think the motivation is for well, let's say the Conservatives or even Justin Trudeau? I mean, I think I can guess what Trudeau's take is. I mean, it gets him prestige in the circles that he runs in. I remember, I lived in Fort McMurray for years, and I was a big defender of the oil sands up there. And I had a film production company, and I made sure to try to get it in to offer my services to every Hollywood star who was coming up to talk about how bad the oil sands were. I thought I'll film what they want, but maybe I can offer them a different view on my community and the industry. Well, a couple of the guys I worked with, these comedians from Hollywood, I asked them outright. I said, you seem most worried about carbon dioxide, and we produce just a fraction of what's going on in your coal production facilities, or just right outside your doorstep. You have the dirtiest oil fields in the world, Placerita oil fields in California. They produce more CO2 per barrel than the oil sands. Why are you coming all the way up here to northern Canada instead of focusing on your own backyard and cleaning up that mess? And what they said was really revealing to me. They said, well, this is the geopolitical hotspot right now, and this is the place that's going to get us laid in the circles we run in. And I just thought, kudos to you for being honest. And to me, that's kind of what I could see that being a thing for Trudeau and some of these leftist elites. But what do you think the motivation is for the people that call themselves conservatives?
Well, I think ultimately, I don't see the Conservative Party being conservative in any way.
Right.
I don't believe that they are. I think that's a cover. And at the end of the day, they like power and control just as much as the Liberals do.
Right.
They've shown us that. They've proven that. And so I make very little distinction between those two political entities in this country. I think our establishment is completely corrupt.
And that's fair. But, the way I look at it, I kind of see if you're playing the game of pragmatic politics, in other words, if you think what needs to be done is you need to win elections and get a seat of power, and that's how you pull some legislative levers and control things and make things better for the world. Well, then you have to get elected, and to get elected, you have to reflect culture. And if culture is leaning left, and I think 65% of Canadians or something like that identify as left leaning, well, I mean, if you want to become prime minister or have a majority government and you're the conservatives, you have to become a left-wing party, even if you don't necessarily believe in all that stuff. You have to say what needs to be said to get there. So to me, it's like a Chinese finger trap almost. You're creating the you're kind of creating you're the architect of your own demise in a lot of ways, because
Yeah,
you know,
and I get that. What it tells me, what it shows me, is a lack of integrity
yeah,
and a lack of moral standing. Because the way I look at things is, and you're right, 100%. Culture is upstream from politics. Politics is downstream from culture, and that's what we need to change. And that's what I'm willing to help facilitate. Through all the town halls that we do, and this education that I promote. And so I'm not willing to sell my soul and my values and my principles to get elected. I don't
yeah,
need to get elected that badly. What we need to do is change the culture in this country
yeah,
so that we're not corrupt as a society, because I see a thorough corruption in our society. And it's not just our politicians that are corrupt. We're allowing them to be corrupt by not holding them, and not, we've abdicated our responsibility to
right,
people we thought had our best interests at heart for decades. We haven't engaged, we haven't taken our responsibility seriously enough.
yeah.
And that in turn, I think, makes us just as corrupt as the political parties are.
Well, and I think you're hitting the nail on the head here. I mean, there's, I don't think it's any coincidence that, rates of divorce that are at an all-time high. At the same time, you see third wave feminists versus men's right activists. At the same time, you see this hyper partisan divide between the left and the right. It's all part of the same fractal of corruption and divisiveness, right? And a lot of it is a unwillingness, like you said, to take personal responsibility. And look, I'm on the front lines of this as an emergency worker. I see it regularly. I've been joking around lately. Every time someone calls me for something that's so minor and not acute at all, a stuck fart, stub toe, you name it. It's like,
Right.
like, what went through this person's mind that they figured they better call the government to help them solve this problem? Because I show up, I'm the government, I'm here to help, I guess.
Yes.
But
It's self-fulfilling in a lot of ways. This is exactly what the government wants out of the people, right? They want this desperation, they want this dependence,
sure,
that from the people. So everyone's dependent on government, and governments love that. They love it because it's control, right?
absolutely, yeah. So I mean, if we're going to, I guess, navigate our way out of this, if we're going to reverse engineer this, it might look something like taking personal responsibility. It might be something like the Petersonian approach, right? Like, clean my room first, increase my sphere of influence, and try to be a positive shift in the culture.
Yes.
So that these bastards don't have a bunch of dependents to rule over, that we're a little bit harder to rule over. Okay. So let's get into a little bit of the details here. Tell me about 15-minute cities. What are these things all about?
Well, again, it's control, right? So they say it's to do with climate change. It has nothing to do with climate change. Even carbon tax and carbon pricing. They've managed through fear and propaganda to get people to willingly hand over their hard-earned money to the government because they're saving the planet. Well, that's not true. It's not remotely true. In fact, in 2012, there was a committee struck at the UN, brought together to determine how best to fund this agenda. And at that time, they assumed that it would be a price tag of around $5 trillion annually. They were wrong. It's $8 trillion annually.
No.
And so they determined the best way to suck as much wealth from where the wealth resides, and that's in the first world, is to come up with a carbon tax scheme or a carbon pricing scheme. And that's exactly what they did. And so they added this carbon tax and carbon pricing as a mechanism to fund this agenda. It's all about redistribution of wealth. And so 15-minute cities is just another way to control the masses. It has nothing to do with saving the planet. The science isn't there to back them. It's all about controlling your movement. It's all about putting the power into this globalist entity in the form of governance. So and the destruction of the nation state.
Right.
And it boils down to controlling the people. Even COVID, Tim, COVID, they've said and they've told us, even Trudeau in the fall of 2020, in a press conference to the UN, he had said that they're using COVID to achieve the goals of sustainable development. I don't know if you remember that press conference, but those were his words.
Right.
And then Klaus Schwab, of course, comes out with a book 2 months into the pandemic, COVID-19 and the Great Reset, and then shipped it to all the politicians in the Western world. Here's the script, follow along. And so all of this has been a mechanism of social engineering and conditioning the masses for what's yet to come. And so at the tail end of this pandemic, of course, in comes, the Ukraine war, which is a whole farce in and of itself. But then you have this talk of 15-minute cities, controlling your movements, getting land usage bylaws in Thorhild, Alberta, is a good example of this. Their influence and trying to restrict people's ability to have chickens, to grow food, their own food, right? And so all of these things are happening at the same time, and it's all about control. It's all about dictating what you're going to eat, who's going to produce the food, who's going to deliver the food.
And my understanding is, I kind of remember this Thorhild thing, wasn't it? Didn't they hire some company, some consulting company, and it has ties to globalism somehow, and they are the ones that came up with these bylaws for the municipality, who are just a bunch of basically farmers who don't know anything about laws and all that kind of stuff. And this is why they're hiring an outside firm to help them, and they end up with this Frankenstein mess of Well,
so it's interesting how that came about and how that happened. So a friend of mine, Tiana, she's doing some good work on social media. She's actually the one that raised the flag on this when the bylaws are being changed. And again, it had to do with, if you live on a parcel of land 10 acres or larger, you're only going to be able to grow or have 4 chickens on that property. What? Jeez. Like, and they're going to dictate as to what you can grow and what you can produce and how many cows you can have and how many horses you can have, all these things. And so she raised the flag, activated the rural municipality of Thorhild, or county, or whatever it is, and the people came together and they actually said, it's not happening. And this is where, the antidote to all of this hyper-centralization and this globalist governance, the antidote to that is self-reliance, self-determination, independence, and community. The lowest common denominator. The people can put a stop to all of this.
Right.
And I think we will eventually. It's just the things are necessary. Things need to happen to inspire people to get active and to say no to these things, right?
Yeah. I think people need to to get uncomfortable, right? I think the status quo just offers too much comfort, and what we're trying to do here is pierce that status quo, and that's not comfortable at all. Believe me, it's not comfortable. I could, over a decade of discomfort can attest to that. But I'd rather pay for it up front rather than later. My kids have to pay it tenfold later, right? And
we see this divide happening between urban centers and rural, and it's getting larger, because at the end of the day, when you talk about self-reliance, self-determination, independence, community, well, that's rural values, right? That has nothing to. It won't be the urbanites that pull us out of this mess. I can tell you. I live in the city, and we don't even talk to our neighbors. Right. Like, nobody says anything to anybody. It's just head down, go to work, come home, stay home. put
Yeah.
your face in front of the TV and then go to bed.
Might as well be living in matrix pods, right? I
Well,
mean,
exactly. And
that's
that's
the
exactly
ultimate
it, right?
15-minute city. That's
Yeah.
a 5 second
And that's
city.
what they want. And that's exactly what they want. So
Right.
so it's going to be rural folks that are going to be activated and are going to be saying no to a lot of this.
Yeah.
You're never going to get rural folks off rural land. You're not going to
Right,
be able
right.
to do that. I don't
Well,
think you're going
yeah,
to be
I
able
mean,
to do
I was thinking about this, right? Because I live next to Edmonton, and I'm like, well, if Edmonton goes full retard here
that. Right.
and like implements lockdowns and 15-minute
Mhm.
cities, I mean, the people around it just aren't going to go into it. I mean, why
Well,
would
and
you ever
this is
want to
it.
go to Edmonton? Like it'll just
Well,
die.
imagine this, Tim. Like I'm trying to look at the implementation of this. They're going to put up cement barriers at certain exits to these communities. How long do you think those cement barriers are going to stay up?
Yeah.
Like I know myself, all out myself right now. I would tie a strap to them and or a chain to them and pull them out of there.
Yeah, man.
As I know other people will too.
Yeah, this
Right?
isn't New York City. I mean, guys around here roll
Right?
coal and have jacked
Yes.
up trucks and
Right. Are you
some
kidding? Are
equipment,
they going to
right?
accept this? They're going to be corralled into a 15-minute, and you have to walk everywhere? Are you
Yeah.
kidding? That's not going to happen.
Yeah, I
It's
don't.
pretty insane that these council people in Edmonton think that that's going to fly. Even in Saskatoon, they're talking about it too.
Right.
And I just,
And now, where did this idea come from? Do you know? Like, where
yeah,
sounds like a slogan, like "Build Back Better." The next thing is 15-minute cities. Someone
yeah.
came up with this brand, and it's kind of permeating everywhere. Where did this come from?
So it comes from the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals under cities.
Okay.
There is a goal that's specific to cities and their development and their sustainability, quote unquote. And so that's where this came from. Now there's a group called ICLEI, ICLEI, and it's a group of cities, essentially smart cities, that are promoting this idea. And so cities like Saskatoon, Edmonton, Vancouver, Calgary, Regina, you name it, most of the big centers are all a party to this group. And then that's where all of this policy comes from. It flows from, ultimately the Sustainable Development Agenda, the goal, and then to this ICLEI group of cities, and then down to City Council, who then, create the policy and implement the policy. And that's essentially where this comes from. And even the land usage bylaws, that's all connected to Sustainable Development Agenda. Anything that you can come up with that you think is crazy, guaranteed it's relative to the Sustainable Development Agenda.
Right, and that's an interesting way of bypassing, federal and provincial governments too, right? They go straight to the municipality
Yes,
almost, and it's
100%. That's how they
you
do
know,
it.
right.
Well,
So
what's interesting in all of this too, Tim, is it's important that people sort of understand. So in 1992, when Canada first committed to this Agenda 21, at that time it was the Agenda for the 21st Century. It's called the Rio Declaration at the first Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. So Brian Mulroney, a Conservative Prime Minister, went down there, committed to this agenda, committed to meeting the goals of it, and at that time it was only had 8 goals. So when he came back to Canada, it wasn't like he tasked all of his MPs or the Liberal Party didn't task any of their MPs to return to their constituents and inform them as to what they just committed us to. In fact, they did the opposite. They framed it, and anybody that was trying to create awareness around this agenda and raise the flag and alarm about it was, of course, labeled and shamed and ridiculed as a conspiracy theorist.
right.
When we knew that they had agreed to this and that the implementation of it would start, and most of it started within the bureaucratic policy throughout the public service, and it wasn't like they got all the public service together to tell them this is an agenda that we're trying to achieve through the bureaucracy. It was very compartmentalized, very departmentalized, and nobody could put a finger on it, other than a few of us that were paying attention and knew what they committed to. So as it evolved through this process, and again signed in 2015 by Stephen Harper and the Conservatives, once again, they deny knowing anything about it. I mean, Pierre Poilievre has voted for this, in favor of this, no less than six times. He sat on sustainable development committees. He's actually never criticized any of the budgets that have been allocated to this agenda here in this country. He's never said a word about it. I had an opportunity, I saw him when he was campaigning for the leadership. He came to Saskatoon, and I had to pretend to want a picture with him for 2.5 hours. And I finally got my chance, and I asked him, so you've denounced the World Economic Forum, but will you denounce the Sustainable Development Agenda, Agenda 2030? And he looked at me straight to my face and said, I've never heard of it. I've never read it. I don't know what it is. Which is a lie. I mean, I know it's a lie because he's voted on it numerous times. He sat on committees. He's approved budgets. He hasn't criticized anything. So, and his party, and the reason he does that is because his party is responsible for committing us to this insanity. And so it's important that people understand that nobody has ever told the people what the consequences to this agenda are. No elected representative, whether it's federal, provincial, or municipal, has ever explained this agenda that they've all committed to the people.
Right.
Nobody's had an opportunity to even vote on any of this.
Yeah.
Why? Why is that? Because they know if they try to sell it to the people would reject it out of hand and probably tell the person trying to sell it to them to resign because it's that insane.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't seem like it would be, I don't know. A lot of people, if you sell it the right way, I think people would love it. They'd eat it up. Don't you think? I mean, it's this is Canada, 65% left.
Some
We're
people
doing
would.
something.
Yeah, some people would. You're right.
So, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have a lot of faith in the people these days. You know what I'm saying? But
right. Well, and that goes to our education system.
Right.
I blame a lot of that on our indoctrination centers we call schools.
Yeah.
And I mean, who's running that gong show? Well, the teacher unions, right? The communists.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's why they were brought over from Prussia, right? Was to create an industrial obedient working class of people. And of course, if you have an institution run by the government, controlled by the government, you don't think they're going to use it to benefit and grow the government? Of course they are. Of course they are. 100%. So, all right, Mark. Well, listen, thank you so much for spending time with me and explaining this stuff. What's going on in your life these days? What are your next projects? Are you gearing up for an election? What's the...
Yeah, so I don't think there's going to be a federal election in the near future. I just don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Trudeau is... I don't think he's electable. I think the Liberal Party has to force him to resign, and they have to put somebody else there before there's going to be a federal election. I don't think they'll run into another election with him as a leader. So I think it's going to be a while before we hit the federal election. We probably have a provincial election in the fall of 2024, possibly the spring of 24 in this province. I'm with the Buffalo Party here in Saskatchewan, and it's another party that's an alternative to the establishment. So I am dedicating a lot of time provincially because I think provincially in Saskatchewan and Alberta, we have an opportunity to kind of lead the country out of the mess we're in. And influence things from that perspective. So I'm dedicating some time to that. I'm still a member of the PPC, and I still support the PPC, of course. But the other thing is I'm really involved in doing these town halls and educating as many people as absolutely possible through my organization, which is called the Forum for Canadian Sovereignty.
Right.
And so I'm going to be quite active in that. I've done over 75 town halls across the country to this point. So we'll carry on doing that. And I mean, it's encouraging when we do these things because, for 15 years talking about this agenda, I was talking to nobody.
Right.
And nobody was listening.
Yeah.
Whereas these days, since COVID's been a blessing because a lot of people were awakened to this, to a lot of things. And we're filling every place we go. So there's a lot of people that are getting engaged and understanding what's happening, and that's nothing but positive. And as more pain comes along, as we talked about, more and more people will wake up. So I think ultimately we win this. It's just a
Yeah.
matter of how much pain we're going to have to endure before we do.
Well, that's just, I mean, Justin Trudeau has made more libertarians in the past 2 years
Yes,
than I
right,
made in the previous 15. So
right,
maybe I've been doing it
exactly.
wrong. But
Yeah.
anyways, Mark, thanks so much for coming on. God bless. Keep up the good fight, and hopefully we'll talk to you again.
Hey, thanks, man. Anytime.
Awesome.